Let me just give you a quick reminder of what a duologue is all about, what the point of this sort of exercise is. We tend to have two kinds of things that have led to us having such polarized conversations. We have a place in our imagination for matters of taste. I cheer for the Broncos, Tim cheers for the Lions for no apparent reason, but he does. And there's no right or wrong about that. If we joke or if we talk about it, it's in a joking sort of fashion. It's just not an issue. On the other end are things that we view as absolutes, things that everyone should believe, and often these are born of our Christian convictions. And if people get mushy on those, we view that to be problematic relative to the actual claim of the Christian faith. And these are things that we may find embedded in the Apostles' Creed or a doctrinal statement that we sign here at Biola or things like that. And so we have a place in our mind for these two things. So you either have a thing you don't care about or a hill that you'll die on. And the problem, there's a huge number of things that occupy not even so much a gray area as an area where they're just under specification. And so you have to make a judgment call. And some of that may emerge from your own personal history, some may emerge from how you read scripture. But the interesting thing that the Bible puts before us on that isn't that it isn't an area of triviality. It's an area of conviction. And Paul exhorts us to let each one be fully convinced in his or her own mind, to remind them that you'll actually stand before Jesus to give an account for your practice on that. Anything that doesn't proceed from faith is sin. The language he uses in Romans 14 to describe the area of personal convictions is very strong conviction language. On the other hand, he says, who were you to judge your brother on this matter of, in this case, days or diets or whatever it might be? That's the area of duologues, areas where we have personal convictions. There's room to disagree, but there's reasons for the conviction. It is not simply a matter of taste. So that's what we do. And the goal of these times is to articulate those things so we understand one another's convictions better. And the other hope is that your own convictions may be refined and improved by hearing others question those or perhaps offer other perspectives that you hadn't thought of. So it's actually a process of refining your own convictions more than converting someone to the other side. So that's the goal. That's the process that we'll do, and that's the kind of the vision that sits behind it. With that said, let me invite our participants to come on up. And rather than me take the time to try and introduce them, we'll just let them do that themselves. We have an interesting broad mix of people from our campus in the different departments we are. So it makes for kind of a fun topic because there's a lot of different places you can go with economics. So let's start over on that direction with Scott, and you can work our way this way.
Good evening. Glad to see all of you here. I'm Scott Ray, Dean of Faculty, Professor of Christian Ethics at Talbot.
Hi, I'm Janelle Aijian. This is my 9th year here, and I teach for the Torrey Honors Institute.
I'm Tom Crisp. I teach in the philosophy department. This is my 14th year here. No, working on my 14th year here at Biola. I haven't quite finished yet.
Shane Enete, Assistant Professor of Finance. This is my 4th year here.
And I'm Dr. Katrina Greene. I teach in the Cook School of Intercultural Studies, and this is my 15th year at Biola.
So let me tell you how this will work. We have 5 questions, roughly speaking, on the theme of what good is money? And just basically unpacking that to get a bit of a vision for a biblical perspective on economics, wealth, and society. So those 5 questions, here's what we will do. Either Tim or I will pose the question, then we'll ask one of our participants to kind of give an opening statement about that. They'll chat a little bit about their perspective on that particular question. Then we'll throw it open to everyone, and we'll have a chance for interaction with that particular perspective, ask them questions, interact for that for about 10 minutes. And once we've done that, we'll move on to the next question. And that will take us about 50 minutes to an hour to get through that batch of questions, and then we'll throw it open to questions from you guys. There will be a number behind me. That number is 562-203-1120 for texting, and it will appear up there. The reason I mention it now is that you may have that brilliant question occur to you halfway through the discussion. We want you to be able to go ahead and text it at any time so when we can process it that way. So we'll have a good chunk of time for asking those questions at the end, and we'll do our best to interact with as many of those as possible. So that's how today will go. And so let me turn things over to Tim for our first question.
Great. Let me start, Shane, with what might seem like a really odd question. But the question would be, is tithing, in fact, biblical?
Tithing, you guys hear me okay? I'm kind of nursing a cold, and so I have a cough drop. But yeah, so tithing, is it something biblical? It's something that seems obviously biblical because it's in the Bible quite a lot. You see tithe mentioned by Abraham when he tithes to Melchizedek. You see it mentioned by Jacob when he tithes to God after seeing a great vision. You see it called for the Israelites to tithe to the Levites, and for the Levites to tithe to the high priest. You even see it in the New Testament more than one time. In Hebrews, you see a tithe mentioned when they talk about that tithe that Abraham gave to Melchizedek. And then you see Jesus, the authority of all, mention the tithe. And when he talks about the Pharisees, he says, hey, Pharisees, you should tithe as well as care for the poor. So it seems like a pretty strong case that we as Christians should all tithe. But my opinion is that we should all not tithe. And so I have a few reasons for that. One reason, which to me is an interesting reason, is that if you do try and practice tithing and you do 10%, then you are actually failing in your tithing. You are not doing what the Israelites did. There are 3 separate tithes. There's a Levitical tithe, a festival tithe, and a triannual poor tithe. Not everyone was annual, but if you do all the calculation, and there's controversy in this, if you want to be tithing the way that it was called for us to tithe under Mosaic law, you would most likely be tithing around 17 to 23% of your income. So yeah, if you can get to there, then that's great. However, I still think you shouldn't tithe because it's law. And I think as a Christian, we are called to not add anything to the gospel. And I think when we do end up saying, I would like to do a 10% tithe on my money, 1, you say my money. 2, it's a form of control. And so you either are going to have one of 2 emotions when you enact a tithe. You're either going to feel very proud that you are fulfilling this law, and then it's going to be very hard for you not to judge others who are not fulfilling the law, or you are going to feel ashamed when you do not fulfill the law. And that's the way the law works. You either feel pride or you feel shame, and it tends to separate you from Christ. So I think the alternative is spoken about in a few different places. My favorite place in the Bible of how we should think about giving as Christians is in 2 Corinthians 8 through 9, particularly when Paul starts talking about the Macedonian church. He talks about how the Macedonians were so excited about what God was doing that they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God, they gave financially. And this idea of giving, Paul kind of stresses this is not a commandment, but see that you excel in this act of grace. And I love the idea that giving is an act of grace, and it flies straight in the face of this idea that we should give as a law. And to me, grace is the lifeline and the lifeblood of being a Christian. And if we can act out in grace, Paul talks about how it benefits you and it finishes things for you. To me, I like to think of it like you see a great movie, it's so exciting, it's wonderful, but you finish the experience of the movie by telling a friend about the movie and kind of doing that. So for me, when you experience the gospel, when you get to be generous because of God's generosity, you get to finish that experience in a beautiful way, and it does a lot to help move you towards intimacy with the Lord. And I'd say in terms of being able to think about how much we should give, because that's the obvious question. If it's not 10%, what should you do? I like to think about the Romans road as a way of discerning how much to do. And in Romans, Paul talks about how you present yourselves to God as dead to sin and alive in Christ. And it says you first know this to be true, then you count it to be true. And to count is an accounting term. It means you see what you have and you take inventory of it. But the last step is to present all of your members to Christ as alive to him and dead to sin. And the interesting thing is it says all your members you're going to present to him. And your members is anything that's touching you. And money is something that touches us very intimately. And it could be any possessions, it could be any relationships, but presenting money as dead to sin and alive in Christ is a really cool way of creating a situation where you're moving finances from law-based thinking to an act of grace. And when that happens, as you receive paychecks, as you receive money, presenting it to God as alive to Him and dead to sin, then you enter into a state where whatever you do with it after that is grace. And so then you could give 0%, you could give 100%, and it's what you want to do. There's a sanctity involved when you are acknowledging who you are in Christ. And I think money needs to be a part of that process. And so I can give more information about the actual mechanics of what I do, but maybe if you guys have that question, otherwise I'll leave it to the floor or to the panel.
We're curious how that resonates with all of you as you listen to what Shane has presented.
I actually think he's right, biblically and theologically. I think you're right to say that the tithe itself was actually much greater in the Old Testament than 10%, and that we are no longer under the law today. It seems to me what the New Testament teaches is that we are to give as generously as we can and without a feeling of compulsion. And I think you're right that the law itself can be that coercive element that I think takes the joy and satisfaction out of giving. So I think giving is a testimony to God's goodness in our lives, and therefore is to be, since God is freely given to us, we are to freely give back to Him.
I think one of the things that I would have a question about, because I do believe we're living under grace as opposed to under law. Thank you, Jesus. What is the role then of preaching tithing to encourage members of the body to support kingdom work? In other words, my understanding and where I've seen tithing being used is to support ministry, to be able to take care not just of paying the pastor's salary, but of providing for needs for members of the congregation, for doing missions, for engaging in a lot of activities. So I agree that we should give because God has blessed us, and it can be over the 10%. But for some people, they need that marker to give at all. And so people will nod and say, oh, but I think there are a number of people that would say, oh, we're living under grace, then I don't need to give 10%. I'll give 2%, I'll give 3%, and we're living under grace, so that's all I need to do. And I'm just wondering if ministry then suffers because of that, because people take it to an extreme and don't look at, oh, I should be giving over, but use it as an excuse to give under and maybe to not give at all. And what does that mean for ministry and work in God's kingdom?
Can I actually jump on that? Because that was almost exactly the same thought that I had, so I'll just sort of add to it. The thing that I was thinking about is the way that you were describing tithing was very much sort of, I'm gonna feel the goodness of God in my heart, and then I'm gonna act on it, which makes me worry about how fickle my feelings are, right? Like there are some months where I'm feeling the grace of God, I see the ad on Facebook with the little baby from Yemen, and I say, yes, I'm going to give to that little baby in Yemen, and I do it. But if I didn't have something set up in my bank account to happen every month, whether I thought about it or not, whether I felt it or not, I don't think I would be consistent. And I don't know that I would have the habits in place to do the thing that if I really thought about it, I do want to be doing consistently. I worry that saying get rid of law also means get rid of good habits.
Great thoughts. As it stands, when right now it's ubiquitous, the church encourages a 10% tithe. Evangelical Christians give 2% of their income. So I think what we're doing now is not working. And I think if people entered into more of a grace-based way of thinking, I think that would actually heighten the giving. And in terms of process, I think there's a lot of interesting ways of creating a fun process. So for me, what I do is I throw out 4 numbers, and it's usually twice a year. And then whatever number I come to is what I'll do in terms of habit. And I do a combination of first fruit giving, percentage of my income, and then residual giving, which is things left over. And I think it's fun to do both, because if you only do first fruit giving by a rule, by habit, it's good, but then you kind of get so used to it, you forget that you're doing it. And I think you miss out on a lot of the benefits of giving, which is this worship. It's worship, that's what you're doing. And residual giving creates a neat situation where you get to kind of see the bounty, and you never assume. So let me go. So I'll finish this thought of that. I throw out 4 numbers. So usually it's 0, 13, 20, and 50, and those are percentages. And I just pray. And for me, what I don't want to do is be resistant to any of those 4 numbers. And if I am, I know something's wrong with my heart. This is about dependency. It's about loving the Lord. And it's grace, and so it could be any of those 4 numbers. And so I want to test my heart and say, all right, am I resisting 0? Am I resisting 50? Let's see where that's at, and then kind of try and get right. And then I do what I want.
Shane, are you saying 50% of your total income?
Correct.
Okay, we're done. Let's. Who asked Shane to be part of it? Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, when I've done that number, it's been so fun. I can't describe it any other way than just fun.
Wow.
And my favorite scripture of all that motivates me and gives me good vision is 1 Chronicles 29 with David, and how he just talks about giving when he's giving to the temple. And I encourage you all to look at it. It's just so fun. He's just having so much fun. And that's how I describe it. And if you can move from worrying about money's the number one cause of anxiety, and there's a reason for that. We're yoking ourselves under a law, and we're thinking everything needs to be, we're bearing all full financial responsibility. And to me, giving is one of the big anecdotes that God's given us so that we can let him kind of rule and reign. But yeah, in terms of habits, I just think it's good to kind of have rules set in place, but then it's good to evaluate them. And so my wife and I, usually once a year, and then my heart too, when we get kind of bonuses or just different little things that may come that's unexpected, And the big tip about this is when money's coming, if you can see it, don't spend it before it gets to you. Think about this before you spend it in your heart. Because if the moment you spent it, because let's say you get a tax refund and they say it's $400, if you immediately say, oh, that's gonna be my phone, or that's gonna be my Kindle, or whatever it is, then to give that away is really hard. But if you keep it as an abstract idea and say, all right, there's this number of 400, and then you seek the Lord with what to do, because it's his money, he may want to pass it along to someone else. And so anyway, so it's a lot easier to give when you keep money at bay, you don't spend it in your mind, and you consult the owner of the wealth first.
So that's a great summary and reflection on tithing. Let's pick up the next question. And this is a thing that some of you guys may want to pursue a little bit. That's why we have the opportunity for you to text some things in. Let me move to a different context. Rather than our personal lives on this, let's think a little bit more about the national, international level. And Katrina, you have spent a lot of time working in other parts of the world. And it led to an interesting question when we were talking together to set this up. We had some time on our back patio just chatting about these issues. And she raised a really interesting question about whether or not there's actually poverty in the United States. And so why don't you talk to us a little bit about that? What would you say in response to that, and why?
Well, first, I want to be clear that I do believe that there is poverty in the United States. I mean, I think if we look, we can see that poverty does exist. I think the question that I want to add to that is, do we experience absolute poverty or more relative poverty in the United States? So absolute poverty is when you have life-threatening malnutrition, life-threatening disease. So you're talking oftentimes about context in the Global South where there are large scales of poverty. So for example, I'm thinking about the slum of Kibera, which is located in Nairobi, Kenya, where you have open sewage running through the streets. I'm talking about some of the places that I've been in Khayelitsha, which is a township located outside of Cape Town, South Africa. When I think about my experiences in other places in the global South, and I compare it to poverty that I see here, I say, yes, we have poverty, but not the type of absolute poverty that you see in places in the global South. Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about the poor here, but I think we have to be clear on what is the measuring stick that we're using, how are we looking at poverty, and that if we're comparing it to other people in a context, it's actually relative poverty and not absolute poverty. I think a larger question, though, is also whether it's absolute or relative, what is our just relationship to the poor? While I think it's important to make this distinction between absolute and relative poverty, I still think that it's important for we as Christians to reach out to the poor and to the marginalized. So in my development classes, which I teach here at Biola, I always tell my students, development is that planned positive change to impact the lives of the poor and or marginalized in order to increase access to resources, lessen poverty, and restore hope. So whether we're doing absolute or relative, what does that look like for how we interact with our brother and sister, especially people who are called to see people as created in the image of God, because we know that we are created in the image of God. So this issue of poverty is huge. It's huge, it's all around us, but I think it's important to look at how we term that poverty and how we describe it so that we can better help to educate others about what poverty is and address poverty not only in the global South, but also in the global North where we live.
Great. Thoughts or questions on this? Tom, you look like you're ready to ask.
Yes. So, Katrina, we talked a little bit about this beforehand. Depending on how you define absolute poverty, so the World Bank defines absolute poverty on living off of the purchasing power equivalent of $1.93 per day. And according to their research, at least in 2013, I don't know what the stats are for more recently, but there were 3.2 million people in the US living in absolute poverty by that definition. And then there's been more recent work by the USC economist Angus Deaton, who argues that if you include the fact that the cost of living and the cost of necessities is considerably higher in the US than in the developing world, a better number for absolute poverty that puts you at a comparable standard of living with the poorest of the poor in the developing world is $4 per day. And he said if you use that number, it turns out there's about 5 million people in the US living in absolute poverty, thus defined. So I wondered what you think about that, because it's, according to these ways of looking at absolute poverty, we actually have a terrible problem of absolute poverty in the US.
And so again, and then you and I also discussed this, while I'm not familiar, with that study, so I will go ahead and admit that, I think the fact that things have to be adjusted shows that you're comparing things that aren't really comparable to each other, because the standard of living here in the United States, the resources that are available here in the United States so far go past what's available in most global South countries that when you look at these scales, they will say things like, oh, we have to adjust for this, we have to account for that. Well, if you do, standards of living costs with this and that. And to me, that goes to my point that we do have more relative poverty because you're trying to find a status group to measure against, as opposed to saying that it absolutely exists. So again, I'm not saying that we don't have poverty, but I think we have to be careful when we say, oh, the same poverty that we have here is what we have in Kibera or in Khayelitsha or in the slums in India. Because oftentimes here in the United States, what we have is safety nets, like our welfare system, like food stamp programs, that don't exist in other places. So it's not that these safety nets always catch people. Sometimes they don't, but at least they do exist here, and they often don't exist in other places. So again,
Anybody else? Thoughts on this issue in our response? What is poverty and how we should be responding? Go ahead, Scott.
I think you started to answer my question. It's similar, Tom, to yours. And how do you take into account the fact that we do have, at least in the United States and Canada and Western Europe, a fairly sizable safety net that's made available by people paying their taxes and things like that to help alleviate some of the symptoms of poverty that we're describing? How does that factor in to how we define poverty here?
I think it has to factor in majorly with regard to that. The fact that we do have safety nets and support systems, and they're not perfect. I'm not arguing that they're perfect, but again, I'm trying to make those distinctions between what we experience here versus what other people experience in other parts of the world. And I think we're responsible for helping to strengthen those safety nets, because there may be some holes in them. But in other contexts that I've seen and experienced, those type of safety nets don't even exist for people to have that option. So for example, take the homeless population. So someone could say, well, Dr. Greene, if you go down into LA, then you will find people living on the streets and defecating on the streets. You know, isn't that similar to what you're talking about with Cabrera? The difference is, here in the United States, we do have homeless shelters. Now, there may be people who say, oh, I'm deciding not to go to the shelter because it's unsafe, or because I've had a bad experience with it, or because they're suffering from some type of mental illness, whatever that may be. But the fact that that exists, where in other parts of the world, that doesn't exist.
So my question, I just want to hear you talk a little bit more about, okay, so then how do I dispose myself differently towards somebody who is in relative poverty versus someone who is in absolute poverty? What do you think the different maybe ethical obligations or something like that are to those two groups?
And let me add to that, are we getting close to asking Jesus, who is my neighbor, when we're trying to make a distinction about poverty?
And we'll let you respond to that as the last word on this question, then we'll bounce on to the
And
next.
please
So
be
go ahead.
sending in your questions. We're hitting these fairly quickly, so please send in your questions. If you want clarification or even a question about what's being shared right now, send it in.
562-203-1120. There you go. Go ahead, Katrina. Finish us up on this.
Our ethical stance. I don't think it should be different. I think we're called to reach out and to minister to the poor, whether it's absolute or relative. But I do think it's careful to talk about terms, because I don't want us to become numb either way to poverty in either context. This question of who is my neighbor, I think is also important. It relates to that idea of not becoming numb, because I believe that we as Christians need to be reaching out to those who are suffering at the margins, whether that be here or in the global south, that all of that is our neighborhood.
Great.
One of the great things we did before what you're seeing right now is we had dinner together, and we got a chance to learn each other's backstories. The Harvard Negotiation Project says the biggest mistake we make is we only share conclusions with each other. We don't share how we arrived at the conclusions. So we had a wonderful dinner and heard about a bunch of things, and it was there we realized, being a diehard hockey fan, a United States Olympic hockey fan, that in fact we had a Canadian with us, which was a bit of a sore spot for those who care about such things and have actually prayed for the Olympic men's hockey team. So Janelle, it was fascinating to hear your story of growing up in Canada, and we were just wondering, is there a problem in your perspective with how the United States approaches these issues compared to your experience with Canada?
Yeah, I do think I have a unique perspective when I come to the States, because I can feel differences in the air that maybe you don't notice because it's just what you grew up in. But there are things about the way that American society functions that are very different from Canadian society. And I guess the question that I continually ask myself is there's a moral question, but mostly a practical question of which of these systems works better, right? Which is actually doing the best job of dealing with money as a society in a way that works. I used an example of maternity leave because that's something that having a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old has touched me deeply and recently in my life. So that's one place where America and Canada are very different. In Canada, everybody is required to, who works, is required to pay into something called employment insurance. And what that means is that when you have a baby, you get 12 months where 55% of your income is paid back to you from that program, so you can stay home with your kid for the first year of their life. And there are tons of psychological studies that talk about the benefits of being home with your children during the first year of their life. It's just way better for them. It's also way better for you if you're able to do that. So in Canada, they've said, hey, I could give every individual the freedom to do with their money what they want, or we could set up a system that actually takes some freedom away from them in a way that's actually going to help them, right? And actually help all of us as a society, because then that means that every child in our society is going to have these benefits. You get similar things, so global health care is a thing in Canada, right? Where everybody pays higher taxes, and as a result of that, everybody pays enough so that everyone can have health care. When I moved to Texas for the first time as a 10-year-old, friends of ours had one of those experiences. I'm sure every one of you knows someone like this, where mom got diagnosed with cancer, they thought their insurance would cover it, it didn't. And they were financially ruined because of it. And the possibility that that could happen blew my 10-year-old mind. It's not even a thing you think about in Canada. It never occurs to you that maybe I won't have enough money to pay for the surgery that I need. Or maybe it'll turn out that I was out of network when I thought I was in network, and so now I have to pay for the whole thing. So there are moments like that where I fall pretty firmly on the side of Canada, not saying that the Canadian system is perfect in any way, but just saying I can see the way that has changed my psychology, right? Like the way that my experience of the world is different because I lived in a society that was sacrificing freedoms for the betterment of all in a way that I think was genuinely bettering everybody's life. So that's my perspective. And when I see things going differently in America, I'm worried. I think that things are worse in some fundamental ways because of that.
So is it fair to call this socialism?
Well, yeah, I mean, so socialism describes a pretty wide range of things, and so Canada is a democracy, they have a free market to a large degree, but, I mean, so there are places where, so for instance, there was a big hullabaloo this summer about dairy, because in Canada, the supply for dairy is controlled by the government in order to make it possible for there to be family farms that can make a living in Canada. So in Canada, dairy farmers can have 80 cows and make a living because milk costs more because the government said it should. And everybody's kind of fine with it. But it so bucks against what an American would say, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's breaking the rules. and Canadians kind of say, like, yeah, my milk is a little bit more expensive. And I'm really glad that there are dairies that can function that have 80 cows in them. So.
What about in American political discussions, you'll sometimes hear, well, yeah, but in Canada, the medical care is abysmal. You've got to wait in line forever. And there are these sorts of stories that circulate. So give us the firsthand report. What's the reality?
So, yeah. Okay, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that. Canadians love their healthcare system. If you've heard that on a conservative news network, mostly conservative news networks would say that, they actually did a vote in Canada for the most important Canadian ever, and Canadians from all over the country voted, and the person that they chose was the guy who invented the social health care system for Canada. Like, I was the greatest Canadian. Which is not to say that it's not longer waits than you get here. If you have money in America, the healthcare system is fantastic. Like, bar none. It's the best system in the world, I think. If you don't have money in America, the healthcare system absolutely sucks. And in Canada, the healthcare system is about the same for everyone, and that means that everybody waits a little bit longer. But you get the treatment you need. At least, I mean, I can't think of any stories of people that I know sort of dying because they were waiting for a surgery. My dad had cancer, and he had to wait, like maybe a month to get in to have the cancer removed? And that was okay. That was enough time. Yeah.
So what's so bad about conservative talk shows when you get certain American candidates that even intimate socialism get hit really hard? And Tom, let me just throw this out to you. In chapel this morning, you had a very provocative, we had a video of different comments by each of the panelists, and you were very clear to make a case about you feeling that capitalism was immoral. We'll get to that in a second. But then you were very clear to say, and I have an alternative, and it's not socialism. So what is it that you're hearing from Janelle that causes you to be a little bit leery of socialism? And Scott, feel free to jump in as well. That sounds pretty good, the candidate, except for the hockey stuff.
Yeah.
But being good at it, that's the...
All right, Tom. We lost in overtime once, and okay, stop.
Yeah, so I think what's going on in Canada isn't really properly labelable as socialism, at least not the classical kind where the state owns the means of production. You have a kind of modified capitalism where the state owns or operates in certain sectors of the economy, but quite a lot still is left to the free market. And the worries that I have would still apply to what's going on in Canada. I have worries about the way companies function in capitalist economies in such a way as to give rise to abusive labor practice and mistreatment of employees. And that's still going to be an issue in Canada for reasons I'll get into when I do my question in a minute here. So I would say it's not really socialism that's going on there. It's a modified capitalism, one that I find attractive in the sense that insofar as the government is ensuring all have access to medical care, I think that's a great idea. So that part I'm all in favor of.
Yes, I have a comment and then a question. I think it probably is fair to describe the Canadian healthcare system as socialism because government owns all the healthcare facilities. It's a government-owned business or a government-owned nonprofit business. Yeah, but I think but it takes a properly functioning system of markets that create wealth in order to have the kind of safety net that you have. And so this I wouldn't call Canada as a whole socialist. I think you're right about that. It's primarily a market economy that generates, significant amount of wealth that makes possible. That's the kind of system you're describing. The places I think where pure socialism has been tried is in Eastern Europe, where I think most of those countries in Eastern Europe, as soon as they could jettison socialism and embrace a market economy, they did. And I'm only aware of 3 countries in the world today that I would call socialist: North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. I'd say that they're all economic basket cases. And the reason for that is because government ownership has, I think, ignored a fundamental aspect of human nature, and that is that incentives matter. And so when you take away incentives for people to work and to better themselves, I think you leave an economy in a worse place. Now, my question is, what is the difference in what you paid in taxes in Canada and what you pay in taxes here?
Well, so I left Canada when I was 18, so I wasn't paying very high taxes.
Or what your parents paid in taxes?
Yeah. So my dad, who makes a good wage, pays about 50% of his income in taxes.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's a lot. But he also doesn't have to pay for healthcare, and he doesn't have to pay for a lot of other things, right? He has now that he's retired, he's benefiting from the government in ways that Americans wouldn't. Yeah, so absolutely, there's a cost there. Is that about what you were saying?
Yeah, I think, in one sense, it's just it's a different social contract.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you pay more, but you expect more. What I worry about is when government takes 50% of my income, I wonder about what that does to people's incentives to take risks, to be innovative, to take initiative, to start businesses when half of what they are going to make from that
Yeah.
goes off to government.
I think it's a balancing act. So Shane and I were talking about this earlier, and he was describing a 91% tax rate and how if that were the case, you just wouldn't work, because why?
1955,
Yeah.
the U.S. tax rate, the top one was 91%.
Yeah. Yeah, and I absolutely agree, but so for me, it's going to be, you have to find the sweet spot, right? Like, you have to find the place where you're paying enough in that everybody's pooling their resources in all the ways that make sense, without paying so much in that it starts hurting people's ability to move forward. And there are lots of thinkers in Canada who will complain about people who are on welfare who don't need to be, and I do think that there is a problem that there is less incentive to work. But I also, so for instance, my aunt had diabetes and was debilitated for the last 20 years of her life, and lived in an apartment that was clean and comfortable and was able to get to a doctor who then she could afford, and the quality of her life, right, it wasn't a matter of her needing incentives, right? The quality of her life would just have been bad because of things that were out of her control if it hadn't been for the fact that the government was willing to care for her in that moment.
Let me actually use this as an opportunity to springboard to the question we're going to ask Tom, because it isn't necessarily a big change, but it flips the picture a little bit, and just ask perhaps the blunt question, is capitalism moral? We're sitting here probing around on socialism. Well, what about capitalism? Is capitalism moral? Talk to us about that, Tom.
Yeah, so in the video clip I recorded for chapel this morning, I was noting that in any given year, there are millions of people around the world that are working in enforced slavery. And it's estimated in the developing world, there's 250 million children between the ages of 5 and 14 working in sweatshops, usually 16 hours a day. And in the US, over 40% of workers are not paid a living wage. That's the wage you need to meet your basic needs without government assistance and have a little bit left over every month to save for emergencies and long-term savings. So over 40% of workers are not paid a living wage. And in the African American community, it's over 50%. And in the Latino community, it's just shy of 60% aren't paid a living wage. And so the question is, why? Why does this happen that you get things like mass enslavement? You get things like mass use of children in sweatshops. You get paying people less than it takes to have a very sort of minimal standard of living. And I think the answer is capitalism for all of its many goods. Capitalism, I think, is an economic system that rewards business owners in proportion to their ability to get their workers to work for as cheaply as possible, as many hours as possible, with as little safety and frill as possible. And if you put it in terms of the love command, the neighbor love commandment in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, love your neighbor as yourself. It looks to me like capitalism is an economic system that rewards business owners in proportion to their ability to get away with not loving their employees as much as they love themselves. So I see real tension between capitalism as an economic system and the love ethics of the New Testament. And I think that should cause us to ask real questions about whether it's a moral economic system. And I want to suggest that there's a better way of organizing our economic lives that, like capitalism, is a market-based system. Now, I think incentives are really important, and that one of the reasons capitalism has been such a phenomenal wealth generator is because it incentivizes work and creativity and creation of businesses and so forth, and that gives rise to wealth. And capitalism has lifted millions of people out of poverty. I mean, that has to be said, and that's a deep good about it as an economic system. But it also gives rise to massive abuses, massive injustices, and labor abuse of the kind I was just describing. So is there a way of harnessing the power of markets, but reducing some of these abuses that go with capitalism? And I want to suggest there is, and it's one that we as Jesus followers ought to be interested in and we ought to try practicing. And that is something I'll call cooperativism, or in Catholic social teaching it's sometimes called distributism. And the idea is to keep the market-based economy with privately owned business enterprises. But in capitalism, what happens is you get businesses owned by capitalists who are the business owners and they're not employees. Whereas in a cooperativist economy, businesses are privately owned, but they're employee owned, so that all businesses would be owned by their employees. And the reason that's a better economic model, I want to suggest, is the incentive structure there works in such a way that you are incentivized to work hard, to be creative, to create, but you also have the incentive to not set up your business so that it involves abusive labor practices, because you, the owners, are the laborers. You, the owners, are the employees. So you have every reason not to set up your business in such a way that it is employing abusive labor practice. And in these kind of businesses, you democratically elect managers, and managers have an incentive to run the business in a way that's employee friendly, because if they don't, they're going to get voted out of their job. So I want to suggest that cooperativism or distributism is a business model that has, or an economic model that has many of the benefits of capitalism, but avoids an incentive structure that incentivizes poor treatment of employees.
Great. Thoughts about that?
Do you mind? So I would say my first initial thought is that there's a movement for corporations and investors called socially responsible investing, or ESG investing. It's actually taken over a quarter of the world's assets in the trillions. And if you were to look at what their mandates are, E stands for environmental, S is social, and G is governance. And the idea is to, on the social and the governance side, is to give employees ownership, and on the governance side is to give good governance so that everybody has a voice. And this corporate social responsibility is this idea of a triple bottom line where you create new types of information of employee productivity, employee satisfaction, and governance, and how things are being governed. All that data is feeding into the system, and companies are becoming and evolving into a place where ownership is getting diluted, and they realize that the only reason a stock goes up is over a long period of time, whether there's value being added, and it's to all stakeholders. The community, the product has to be benefiting people over a long period of time. If you look at the value of a stock, 2/3 of it, or 75% of it, is the worth of the cash flows that happen after the first 10 years. And so when people are trying to understand the worth of a company and the incentive of a manager, when he's looking at what he wants to, if he wants to increase the stock price, he needs to think long term. And I think a lot of people in this kind of movement they're moving towards giving this ownership that you're suggesting. So I guess my main thought is that capitalism and the new type of structure are not necessarily incompatible, is my main thought.
And I guess I would want to push back a little bit, because as an economic anthropologist, my first response is, how does this become practical? So take a company like Microsoft. If you say, oh, we want the employees to be the owners of the company, do the current shareholders sell those interests in the company to the workers, and the workers buy that? Like, I could see if you have a system that starts like that. I guess I'm wondering, how does this work practically in an already existing capitalist system where you have private ownership? Does the government tell company owners you must sell so much of your company to the actual employees? And I'm just wondering, how does that work practically? Because in South Africa, in the post-apartheid period, there was something called Black Economic Empowerment, where different companies were encouraged to bring blacks into shareholding ownership. And so they were giving them incentives to do that. But we found out that a lot of times it was just very tokenism. That yes, you said, oh, we have this many people that are shareholders, but they really didn't have any type of power over decisions, because they did not have the background to be able to actually run the company. And so I guess I'm just wondering, how does this practically get worked out in our capitalist system as it exists now?
Yeah, so the short answer, my short answer is I don't know. I don't know how you move, especially in a top-down way. I don't know how it could happen realistically that the government would mandate a move in this direction. I could see it happening piecemeal, gradually, by governmental policies that are meant to incentivize the creation of cooperatives, and that over time, perhaps more of them would arise by that kind of policy. I also think it's worth thinking about, as Jesus followers, this motto that used to be prevalent in the Catholic worker movement, creating a new society in the shell of the old. And so that perhaps we as Jesus followers can start practicing cooperative business styles. And so instead of banking with Bank of America, I could bank with my local credit union. Instead of shopping at Ralph's, I could shop at the local food co-op. And if I and those with whom I church lived in this way and it started to spread, we would be creating a new society in the shell of the old. So maybe grassroots.
Scott, if you had a question there, then we'll move to you for the next question. So,
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your humility in admitting that you're not exactly sure what this would look like on a larger scale. So I'm reluctant to assess that idea until I understand a little bit more about what your vision for that actually looks like. But I think what you describe, I think actually most public companies today have fairly widespread employee stock option programs. And they recognize that that's just good business. And it's good because, for many of the reasons that you described, because it gives employees a sense of ownership, a sense of pride, and a sense of accountability for the work that they do, and a greater sense of loyalty to the organization. So, I think that ownership is widely shared in most public companies. And I think the shareholder, the owners actually are not, in most cases, not single individuals or small groups. The owners of most public companies are folks like us. Main Street owns most of the public companies in the United States and in Europe today. And we do so to make our retirements work and other things like that. I have a hard time calling capitalism immoral because it's a system that, as you recognize, I think has raised about half the world's population out of absolute poverty in the last 150 years. And since 1970 has lifted not quite 1.5 billion people out of grinding subsistence level poverty. And I admit, capitalism is not perfect. It's a human creation. It's not handed down from on high. But of all of the human creations that human beings have come up with, I'd say it's pretty close to the top of the list of good ones because of the wealth that it generates. And I agree that it does increase the temptation to consumerism and materialism. But like greed, I would call those human vices, not necessarily economic vices. And there was rampant greed and materialism in all the socialist countries in Eastern Europe as well. I want to look at the positive side of that too, that the wealth that's generated by market-based systems is what makes charity possible. It's what makes most medical research possible. It's what makes the safety net around the world as rich as it is. And you're absolutely right that in a lot of the developing world, there is no safety net. And God help the poor in those countries. And it's what makes the arts largely possible. So I think there's a lot of good, and it gives rise to creativity and innovation. I think it's in very productive ways. It channels a person's self-interest, I think, in healthy ways instead of unhealthy ways. I look at, take somebody, for example, that is characterized by the fruit of the Spirit as opposed to the deeds of the flesh. Which of those people is more employable? I don't think that's even close. And so I think I'd want to recognize that the system itself presumes, I think, a fairly high modicum of virtue and trust and openness for it to function properly. Not to say there aren't abuses, And I think some of the abuses you described are in parts of the world where I would suggest that markets really haven't been tried fully. That what you see is, I think, an incomplete version of that.
So Scott, let me transition. I know, Tom, I know. We'll do it. So we're going to transition to Scott. He'll be our last panelist. So please, right now would be a great time to send in your questions. 562 Ralph's. No, I'm just kidding, Tom. It's just a joke. So Scott, let's ask I'm just kidding, Tom. How about this question? Is income inequality a problem? Is the fact that we have inequality a problem?
Not necessarily. I think it can be, but in most cases I say probably not. And here's why. We have all sorts of natural inequalities that I don't think anybody loses any sleep over. Look, I had a huge desire when I was a kid to play in the NFL. But with this physique, that's not going anywhere. And it didn't matter how many weights I lifted, how many steroids I took. It just wasn't happening because of the way God made me. My kids, my two youngest boys, had a huge desire to be NBA basketball players until I informed them that their mother is just a shade over 5 feet tall. And none of that was ever happening, no matter how hard they tried. Second, some inequalities are a result of our choices that we make. Some people make choices to pursue things that they are particularly passionate about that may not pay particularly well. Artists, people who work for nonprofits,
University professors.
I'll let you say that and not me. And then I think we have inequalities too because of some poor choices that people make. The decision to drop out of school, to forgo an education, to have children out of wedlock. All of those things are pretty strongly correlated with income disadvantage. And I think third, we need to recognize for most of human history, we've been strikingly equally poor, wretched, and miserable. And when markets came onto the scene, they did create inequalities for the reason that people elevated themselves and bettered themselves at different rates as they engaged in market activity. Inequality is a problem, however, when it's the result of injustice. Now, to be clear, inequality and injustice are not the same thing, and inequality is not always the result of injustice. In fact, I think in a lot of cases it's not. But for example, it's unjust when a child gets a terrible education simply because of their zip code. That's an inequality that's unjust and needs to be fixed. It's unjust if somebody is denied a promotion or a job opportunity or an educational opportunity simply because of the color of their skin or of their gender. I think it's unjust when serious illness wipes out a family financially. But inequalities that are a result of hard work, that don't come directly at the expense of others, which in a market economy they typically don't do, I don't lose sleep over. It doesn't bother me that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have the wealth that they do because it wasn't taken from me. My life has been better, and I expect most people in this room, 10 years from now, you expect that your life will be better than it is today. The other time inequality is a problem is when people lose hope of moving up. And that's a problem. And I think there's a legitimate debate over whether we've reached that point today. I say ultimately the problem, though, we're shooting at the wrong target with inequality. The problem is not that some people have more or less than others. The problem is that some people don't have enough. And I would suggest the problem is poverty, not inequality. And so, in my view, let's make sure we're actually fixing the right problem.
So would you say then, Scott, that the issue then is not so much income equality, but combating structural inequalities? Because the examples you gave of injustice were things that happen to individuals or groups of individuals that's often outside of their control. It's not personal decisions. It's because of systems that exist So the child who is in that zip code, who goes to an under-resourced school, where the teachers aren't incentivized, who then, graduates but doesn't have the skill sets they need to get a job, who then isn't as employable. That's a structural inequality that gets reflected in income inequality.
Yeah, I'd call that, I think that the fact that educational opportunities are so skewed based fundamentally on where you live, I think is a structural problem that needs to be addressed. I think we can have a pretty vigorous debate over the best ways to do that. I'm not personally persuaded that just throwing more money at schools is actually helpful. I would favor more of a solution that would give parents choices and bring competition into the public schools to make them better. But we have a lot of debate about the means, but I think you're right that the end that we ought to be concerned about is something that's bigger than just a personal choice.
And can I push back a little bit on poverty being the only problem with income inequality? I think power is important to consider. So I like to think about poker as the analogy, but the moment someone gets too many chips, it doesn't matter who else is playing. They can have their way, and there's always a buy-in in life. And I just think the moment, and everyone can be virtuous players and trying to do goodwill, but the moment all the chips are on just a few people's sides, they have power, and then there's a lot less that happens. I think there's a lot of problems that happen, even if the people on the other side don't have poverty.
Here's why
Scott, can I just say a little bit more about that? Because one way that power can manifest itself is access to political power.
That's the point I was going to make.
Okay, yeah, so you...
No,
We'll let you wrap your part up with this, and then we'll take audience questions.
That's I think, a great point. When people use wealth to buy political influence. The irony here, though, is that often the solution to that is more government control over the economy, which in my view just creates more and more opportunities for people to buy more and more influence over the way economic decisions are made. So I think that's definitely a factor. And we could have a lot of debate over the best way to solve that one, too.
Do you want to go to some questions?
Yeah, let's go to some questions. I have one that actually probably may be a good follow-up for some of the things that Scott was saying, and others can weigh in as well. But when we talk about modern economic systems, we often talk about them as not being a zero-sum game. And the idea is that we can expand wealth more or less without any particular limit on that. But this question asks, capitalism, even with worker owners, thrives on consistent growth. And you begin to think of where this goes, this person observes, in a world with, at one point, ultimately limited resources. In other words, we all share a common planet. And there's things we often do with the excesses of our consumption that start to destroy that. How can we as Christians justify a system that defies our stewardship responsibilities and will ultimately lead to crises relative to our natural earthbound resources, so to speak?
Well, I'm maybe not quite as skeptical about the limitation of resources and the impact that has. Obviously, our resources are limited. But the thing that's not limited is the human capital, which is where capitalism actually gets its name from the Latin caput, meaning the head. And the human capital, I think, is virtually unlimited. And so take, for example, there are lots of places around the world that have virtually no natural resources that have thriving, wealth-generating economies. I mean, take, for example, the tiny, tiny country of Singapore has virtually nothing going for it in terms of natural resources except for its location as a port. But it has this incredibly thriving economy. The difference between North and South Korea is striking. It really has nothing to do with any kind of difference in natural resources. The one thing that I'd want to be really careful about, and I'm wondering if that question is something like climate change in the backdrop to that. I think we probably all agree that eventually we'll probably all get to a place where we will run on renewable energy. What I want to make sure of is that we fulfill our biblical obligation to the poorest of the poor in making that transition. Because I think if the launch ramp to renewable energy, for example, is too short, I think we have consigned a good number of the rest of the poorest of the poor around the world to perpetual poverty. Because the two things that are essential for escaping poverty in a market-based system are education and cheap, plentiful energy. And so I want to be careful that as we make that transition, we don't also ignore what I think is a very high biblical obligation to the least among us.
Do you think, though, Scott, that there's a role, even a robust role for government in shepherding that transition? Or do you think that the market will, on its own, make that transition in time before climate change has become too much of a problem?
I'm not particularly optimistic that that government is able to make it work apart from market-based incentives. I think we would all have solar power today if it were economically feasible. In fact, every time I get a call from a solar company probably once every 2 weeks. It says, what's your electric bill? And is your electric bill over $150 a month? And mine's not. And they hang up on me. they're not interested because it is not economically feasible yet to put it on a wide scale. I think it will be eventually.
Yeah. Let me go to a question that if you listen to the President's State of the Union address, this was in the background. So I think this is a particularly timely and provocative question. My conservative father doesn't think it's fair that part of his taxes go to illegal aliens instead of American citizens. Can you really expect Americans who are so aware of the immigration crisis and border conversation to be okay giving upwards of 50% of their income to the benefit of all when that all includes illegal aliens? So then what is the solution?
And this is an interesting question because it overlaps obviously between economics and border issues. But in some ways it's a good example about how hard it is to actually isolate economic issues. They usually don't come in a clean, separated package.
Yeah.
So I'm just making it more complicated for you, but anyhow. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
My initial thought is that, especially with the Canadian example, what you're seeing in Europe, and I think will eventually happen in Canada, is a decline of the baby boomer generation, which is the wealthiest generation we've ever seen in the history of the world, and a decline in all population as fertility is going down. Those two trends will actually create an unsustainability of social programs. And you're seeing that happening in France and in Southern Europe, where there's 20-30% unemployment amongst the youth, and the people who are older are not letting go of their jobs and their good programs, and all of the immigrants coming in are not supported. And so my short answer to that question is I don't think it is. I think when you try and have immigration, when you try and care for the poor, you can't create big social structures, big social safety nets. I think it all falls apart is kind of my initial thought about it.
Anybody else?
I mean, so I can't predict the future, and I don't know whether that is in fact going to happen. It might, right? It might turn out that the prosperity that is allowed for those social systems is kind of a unique moment in history that's going to pass. I don't necessarily think that means that they're a bad thing in the moment where they're taking place. And I mean, so when it comes to the question of whether my tax dollars should be going to support someone who's coming into the country illegally, I mean, so one thing I would say is that people who have come into the country undocumented don't get a lot of resources and actually have very difficult lives here. But another thing that I would say is, as Christ followers, I think the question isn't whether this person is an American. I say this as a Canadian. It's whether they're my neighbor. And so all of the justifications that we've been using to describe sharing, whether that's through government resources or whether that's through a church or something like that, but giving of my abundance to somebody who is in need, it's never been on the basis of where they're from. In fact, we've been talking about the needs, particularly of those who are in absolute poverty in places like Nairobi. So I guess my response to that particular dad who's frustrated about the fact that his government money is going to these people who have come into the country illegally is to say, I think they're still my neighbors, and I think their suffering still matters to me. And that doesn't mean that I necessarily have to agree with what they've done, and that doesn't imply anything very particular about the kind of life that they are owed from me or something like that. I don't necessarily think it's a right, but I do think it's a question of compassion and care.
There's also the point that undocumented immigrants actually pay quite a lot in taxes, property taxes, sales tax. Many of them pay into Social Security without any hope of ever getting back from that. So there's a lot of taxes paid by undocumented immigrants. It's not that they're purely taking from the social welfare system without paying in. I think there are legitimate questions about whether we can afford a social welfare system that coexists with very generous immigration quotas, more open borders. I think those are legitimate questions. But ultimately, I think Janelle is exactly right. From the standpoint of a biblical ethic, the parable of the Good Samaritan, I think the key element of it is that the Samaritan helps the robbed man who's on the other side of a whole bunch of boundaries, national boundaries, ethnic boundaries, racial boundaries, religious boundaries. The Jews and Samaritans really did not like each other, and they were thought to be other. And yet Jesus' point is none of those boundaries matter. What matters is this your neighbor? Is this someone in need and in reach of your care? And if so, they're someone that we're called to love and to help. And so I think that's really the key issue here.
Let me pick up on something that's a little bit related. Someone asked this a question about what degree of responsibility for our safety net and the social needs of people we may find who are in poverty. What portion of that should be church responsibility, and what portion should be governmental, mandated structures that provide for those needs? What's the role of church and the role of government in the alleviation of poverty?
And I would say that there's a role for both. I don't think it should be an either or. I think it should be a both and. Because
specify a little bit of which would be doing which.
Even though we're a quote-unquote Christian nation, there are more and more people who are not identifying with being with any particular denomination or even as being Christian. So to say, it's just the church's responsibility when you have some of the things that are happening with the church, then I think that will leave us with insufficient resources to cover what exactly needs to be done. Because I would actually say that one of the great things about the U.S. that can be strengthened even more is that we do have this strong social net. And so I think anything that can be done to strengthen that through the church and government is important to do.
I have a tangible idea to help strengthen that. And it's based on the assumption that given a similar amount of resources, organizations that are local can feed, clothe, and house more people more efficiently than the federal government can. And the idea, I think you're right, if we don't change the resource allocation, volunteer organizations, they get their boat swamped really quickly. But what I would suggest is a change in the tax code to make charitable contributions to organizations that serve the poor. Instead of making them a tax deduction, make them a full tax credit. And I think if that were done, then that would free the tax burden and it would provide incentives to provide, I think, far more resources to organizations that have more boots on the ground, that are much closer, and I think could operate much more efficiently.
And this would be an example of a governmental structure that would be tweaking a free market, but you would be okay with that?
That'd just be changing the tax system. I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just saying this is a policy intervention that will be steering dollars. It's not Milton Friedman's version of free market.
although Friedman had no problem with taxes. But
Yeah, but this is an incentivized. I'm fine. I'm just wanting to specify because I hear echoes of people I know shouting in my ears of anything that we do to tweak and adjust these things. You're simply just creating, false things. And I go, well, yeah, it's an interesting question. Janelle, did you have something you want to add to that?
So my concern, so I've heard this argument run, like just stop taxing us so much, we'll give our money to local churches and they'll do the work that you want the government to do better and more efficiently. I wish that I could believe that were true, and I just don't. I just genuinely, so I guess one thing is a question about scale, and I think that while in some ways I agree with you that local bodies can be more efficient, I actually think that there's tons of duplication in those local bodies that actually gets taken care of in a good large structure, right? So you actually end up with a structure that is more efficient and more professional, and rather than, I mean, just think about the fracturing of the church in La Mirada, right? Like how many churches are there in La Mirada? Each one of which has an administrative pastor and a care pastor and a head pastor and teaching, right? Not to mention all of the costs associated with all of the work that they're trying to do, most of which isn't being coordinated in any kind of reasonable way. I think that if we had something like the old world church as a single unit working together as one, if that ever existed in a way that we would have liked, that might be able to do the job we're describing. But I'm not sure the church as it exists now in America is a very good way of doing these works of justice, just because it's so fractured and so disorganized.
yeah, I'm not limiting this to the church.
Oh, sure. But I mean, anything, like volunteer organizations are the same way, right?
Homelessness, I think, is a good example of this. It's very difficult to find churches or private organizations that are willing to house the homeless in any kind of sustained way. Most churches won't do it. The only entity that seems to do it in any kind of really robust way is the government. So far, the track record of small private associations, at least with respect to a problem of deep poverty like homelessness, is not a very good one.
Even though I think that's a bit more consistent with some of the Catholic teaching that you've been referring to about subsidiarity and coming, always making those mediating institutions as close to the people in need as possible.
Yeah, so as you were saying that, I was thinking, subsidiarity. I wonder whether that idea could be harnessed in something like this way, where you maintain a robust government involvement in social service providing, but it works by grants, block grants, these kinds of things. So the government tells the state or tells local cities or something, you need to house this many homeless people per year. How you do it is up to you. Here's the money. Now make it happen. I wonder if there were more of that, if that could work.
Can I go around really, quickly might be too much, but let's talk about the elephant in the room. With economic stewardship, what would be our comment about increasing student debt, student loans, and the cost of higher education? And I'm only going to ask those with tenure to respond. No, I'm kidding. just a joke. Just a joke. But what would we'd be amiss if we didn't address that issue. What are our thoughts as people committed to Christian higher education? What's our thoughts about that?
Could you say thoughts about what exactly?
Well, economic stewardship and the amount of debt that students are accumulating.
Whether student debt is a good or bad stewardship of resources.
Yeah.
Do you have an answer to that, Shane, or you just...
I will say studies have shown that if people would, instead of debt, they would say that a part of their paycheck would go to whoever's lending them money, all student debt would be eliminated. So there are different ways of structuring affording something. And so, for example, if you want to become a boxer, a boxing manager will take 10 people from the street and give them all a shot. And then if one of them makes it, then his future earnings go to that manager. And the same could be said for students, where if everyone was given a free education, but then their, to the degree of their success would go towards whoever gave them that free education. That's another type of form of paying for school that I think is interesting. You're seeing that happen in what are called income-driven repayment plans that are mandatory in Australia and in the UK and are starting to get towards that way, where they're taking a percentage of your income after you graduate instead of having it be a debt. So that's just one thought, is that there's other ways besides debt to pay for school. And the last thing I'll say is the moment student loans, the government stopped increasing the amount you could do was the moment that private education stopped increasing its tuition. And private education has not increased its tuition in many, many years. And what you're seeing in public schools is it continues to go up. But I think the fact that they made college very easy to access funds for increased the price of it, and I think that's a big problem.
I would just say that with any type of debt, you need to be thoughtful going into it. In other words, I'm always concerned if I talk to students and they say, oh, I don't know how much debt I owe. I'm like, nope, that's not good. You should know how much debt you owe. It's different. I went to school over 20 years ago. I was an undergrad, and things have changed so much now with regard to just the opportunities for students once they graduate and what students are looking for. I still believe in getting a college education. I am still a fan and an advocate of that. I think that the focus needs to be on, yes, how can students help to reduce their debt, but also looking for ways that students can pay back the debt that they do owe. So if it comes down to, should they take out loans or not go to school? Then I would say I think students should take out loans. But how can we help them with regard to reducing those amount of loans, as well as in helping them to pay those loans back? I took out loans, and I got a wonderful undergrad education, and I was able to pay those loans back. And so it's great if you can go to school without taking loans. But most people that I know, even in my generation, had to take out loans to go to school. And so it's this idea of understanding, what are you taking out? Why are you taking it out? And do you have a firm, at least view in your mind that there needs to be a plan of how you're going to pay them back?
Mm-hmm. I want to suggest, too, that it's an issue that the Christian community ought to be particularly concerned about, because I think we should think of our job as a Christian university to be graduating students who go out and become agents of shalom, and go into dark places and hurting places and places of tremendous poverty, and function as agents of shalom there. But sometimes that means being willing to work for nothing, being willing to work for very low pay, and a lot of our students just can't do that because they are graduating with such a high debt load. And so I think our actual mission as a Christian university is being compromised by the fact that students have to take so much debt to get an education. And it's a big problem. I don't exactly know what the solution is, how to get from point A to point B, but I'll tell you what I think point B looks like, and that is that the Christian community financing education for young Christians who want to go and get a Christian college education and then go out and be an agent of shalom. It ought to be that students who want to go out and be radical disciples of Jesus can do that, and we as a community need to figure out how to make that happen.
Let's take 30 seconds for last comment as we go around here, because we're basically at the end of our time. So just a really quick, one thing you'd want people to take away who are here tonight, and just make sure they remembered. Scott, we'll start with you and work our way this way.
You want me to start? Yeah, I guess the one thing I'd like people to take away is that even though markets have flaws, because they're flawed human beings that participate in them, and they do reflect the values of the culture that they're embedded in, I do think that markets are one of humanity's very best creations. And I think the best hope for the poorest of the poor around the world is their participation in the global economy.
Janelle.
I was trying to think of what to say, and I don't mean this to be immediately against you, Scott. I actually think they work together, but the thing that I'm thinking is, I actually think another one of the greatest creations of humans is government. And if a government is run well and carefully and with the best interest of the people in mind, I actually think that it can use money very effectively to make people's lives better. And there are lots of examples of those abuses, and there are lots of places where even governments that I would look to as examples are doing stupid and unfortunate things. But I think that government conceived rightly is an opportunity for us to get away from the powers of the market and moments where they hurt and cause suffering. And that the two have to work in conjunction if you're going to get a society that's really taking care of everyone and producing the wealth that it takes to do that well.
I guess I would say that we Christians, we followers of Jesus, have the opportunity to create a new society in the shell of the old. We can do things differently. We can start cooperative businesses. We can support cooperative businesses. We can go out and work for little money, no money, and be an agent of shalom in dark places. And that we should think of ourselves as a countercultural society, both in terms of economics, how we use our money, what we do with our college education, all of that. We have the opportunity to be a counter society, to look really different than the rest of the world.
If you find yourself worrying about money, if it's keeping you up, if you're kind of trying to figure out how to control it, control your fate, I encourage you to be generous, to experience the gospel, go under the unyokedness of grace, and let God take care of you. He's very generous, and he's very good at being a father that takes care of his children.
I would just encourage students to be salt and light wherever they are, wherever they see places of marginalization, issues of poverty, to be able to speak into those and to be able to use the resources that you have in ways to benefit others who don't have those resources. And it starts with being intentional and being aware, knowing what's going on around you, asking questions about what you do see, and then saying, okay, Lord, what would you have me to do about this particular situation? Don't ignore it.
That's great. Tim, anything else you have?
Yeah, I would just say that I think the greatest argument for Christian higher education is what you've just heard in the last hour and a half. I think to come in a period of your life and sit under people who have gone before you and have thought very deeply about these issues, and don't always agree, there's differences, but to take a season of your life and be under this kind of teaching, this kind of thoughtful introspection, I think is probably the greatest argument we have for Christian higher education.
And I hate to agree with Tim, but that was a pretty good thought. I would absolutely echo that. And I also want to say a word of thanks to all of you guys for taking some time out of your evening to stop and think a little bit more deeply about this. Because people talk about money mattering. It really does matter, but not always the way we think about it. I think it matters a lot for us as Christians. And I'm really grateful for you guys taking the time you did to give us some really, really thoughtful and provocative input, and for you all to come and join us. So thanks very much for being here.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.